Hello, and welcome to A Reader's History of Science Fiction, Season 2, Episode 13. I'm Alex Howe, and with me today is Gary Bengier. Gary is the former CFO of eBay and a science fiction author. His first book, Unfettered Journey, was released in 2020 and is described thus. Unfettered Journey is the story of Joe Denkensmith, an AI scientist who seeks to create true robot consciousness. He leaves everything behind to find answers, but a mysterious woman on a personal mission interrupts his search. Fighting unjust forces, Joe is swept into an evil plot that neither can elude. Their struggles against machines, men, and nature test the resilience of the human spirit. Hello, Gary. Thank you for coming on the show.
Well, Alex, it's a delight for me to be here. So my book Unfettered Journey came out during the pandemic, and it's been doing very well. It's won 11 book awards, and it's now out in 8 languages. In the past year, Japanese and Russian. So I'm very pleased with its acceptance.
And what led you to write this book?
Well, let's see. You mentioned earlier, one of my last companies that I worked for was eBay, and I hung around there until there were several thousand employees and $100 billion worth of stuff being sold, and that was the cap of a 30-year career in tech. So I was in everything from bioscience for half a dozen years, computer peripherals, computers, hard drives, terminals. And then I was in high-tech windmills for a short time. I was in chip design, so electronic design automation, designing the heart of chips, and then streaming video over the internet, and then the internet. So I had the great fortune of participating in a lot of the key technologies over the last 30 years. When I retired from eBay, I did some nonprofit work. And then I went back to school. I actually went back and backfilled an astrophysics degree. And then I went from that getting interested in philosophy, which was something that was an interest for 30 years. And I backfilled a philosophy undergraduate degree. And then I earned a master's in philosophy, focusing on theory of mind. And that led me to writing this book. It was the philosophical ideas, thinking about what is the mind really? What is human consciousness? Do we have free will? And I wrote a companion to this book that is actually sort of fairly esoteric philosophy. And then I decided to write Unfettered Journey as a more accessible way to talk about some of these topics. So that's the long history.
That sounds like a lot of bouncing around.
Well, there's some people that think that careers are something you plan, but I'm a firm believer in the complex system of the world. It's non-linear. I'm also on the board of the Santa Fe Institute, and in fact, I was just at a science set of meetings last week in Santa Fe, and the world really is non-linear. We don't really know what might happen tomorrow. You could wake up on a February day and find out that Ukraine has been invaded, and who knew? The world changes. Mm-hmm. And I'll mention that because today in the news, the Ukrainians have retaken the city of Kherson in the south. Yes. So that just shows that, the world really is nonlinear. Who can predict that stuff? So yes. That's a context that I use when I think about the future and science fiction.
Yes, and we're recording this on November 11th, and who knows, we may wake up tomorrow and Twitter will be gone.
That's right. And so that leads to an interesting point. As I said, I strongly believe the world is nonlinear. It's a complex adaptive system. But at the same time, I think that we can look at trends, for example, in technology, and we can look at the ones that are most likely, and we can make some predictions for the longer term about what is more likely than not. And so that idea is behind the hard science view that I have in my book, Unfettered Journey. So that book takes place in the year 2161, which is roughly 140 years in the future. And the reason I chose that as the scene is that I don't believe we can know what will happen in this next decade, but I do think that far enough out, that's the near future, we can make some reasonable projections about what is more likely than not. And so I'm a believer in terms of science fiction that it's important for us to use science fiction for that purpose. That is, we should, one of the important goals of science fiction, particularly if you go back to the golden years of science fiction, Isaac Asimov, the 1950s, that science fiction can help us look ahead. And I think that then it can help us focus on the most important problems that face humanity and helps us focus our attention on solving those.
I find it interesting that you said it that far out, because I feel like there are a lot of people in the tech industry today who think robots will take over the world by 2050.
Okay, well, that's a great thought, Alex, and maybe we can pursue that for a moment. So, because I think that's great. Okay, so here's my hard science view of the future in the frame. It goes something like this. First, I think that in this next century, the two most important technologies driving the future of humanity are, number one, bioscience, which, as I said, I was in for half a dozen years, in the separations chemistry that supplied Genentech and others with the technology to sequence the human genome. And now we have CRISPR-Cas9, and we have another acceleration in that technology. So that's one. Two is AI and robotics. Okay, so bioscience on one side and AI and robotics on the other. Those are the most important technologies. What I believe is that the first one in a century or so, we won't notice in the sense that we'll live longer. I don't think we'll live forever, but we'll live longer. We'll live more healthy lifestyles. I think maybe we'll cure cancer. We'll cure a lot of other things, but that's just will be normal. Okay, that's the way life will be. In the same way that today we don't have polio except a tiny number of places in the world. But the thing that we will notice will be the AI and robotics in our day-to-day life. So now, Alex, you mentioned that some futurists think that by 2050 we'll have robots all over the place. So given that I say that yes, robots are inevitable, I think those ideas are way too early. I think this will take a lot longer than most of those futurists believe. And the reason is that it just takes a long time for technology to actually get into the world. The automobile, it took 100 years beyond Henry Ford to really get to the automobile we have today, because you need roads, you need legal systems, you get a lot of problems to overcome. That's just basic engineering. And so I think robots will be really annoying for a long time because they just won't work the way we expect them. There'll be all kinds of unknowns. But at the same time, I think that's an engineering problem that is from A to Z. We can see it. The economics will drive that to happen. The military will be spending lots of money to build robots that will replace humans on the battlefield so that we avoid casualties. And then as businesses automate more and more, they will continue to really replace people with robots. And so I think that it's inevitable, but that it'll take a long time. So that's my view of the future. Hard science view, those two technologies driving our future. And now let's think about the one that I said is the one that we will find most impactful in our day-to-day life. That is when robots are walking around among us. When we finally build the standard chassis and we work down the learning curves and they become better, faster, cheaper, and then robots continue to start building robots, right? When robots are mining the ores, smelting the metals, robot factories are being built by robots. When robots build robots, then all of the jobs will be gone. Almost all of them. I think, Alex, maybe we'll have podcasters, right? we'll have politicians, but the last of those sort of typical jobs will be gone, and we'll have lots of stuff. Okay, and so the economics will be fundamentally changed. And this is an idea that's been talked about for a long time. I think some of the great economists 100 years ago John Kenneth Galbraith and others of that era were talking about the economy is becoming more efficient. Then people have so much free time that we have 12-hour weeks. Well, that hasn't happened, but they thought we'd have 12-hour weeks by 1990, but that hasn't happened. And because it hasn't happened, we tend to think, well, that was not a very enlightened idea. But I think they were just wrong on the timing, and they were wrong on what the driver was. And the driver, I think, will be robots that can finally do the job of humans in day-to-day life. So there's the future, I think. As I said, I think this is a highly likely future where robots are walking around among us. They're about our size because they will fit into all the human scale infrastructure, the trillions of dollars we've spent to build that. And they'll be doing most of the job. So we'll have lots of stuff and not much work. And so then my book, Unfettered Journey, poses that world in 2161 and asks the question, how do we find meaning and purpose in that highly likely future?
Just a point of personal curiosity, what's the power supply for these humanoid robots?
Okay, good question. So, and that gets to a question some others may be asking, what happens, climate change, et cetera. And the main character, Joe, is flying over the country, looking down as he is pursuing his quest to find out the secret of consciousness itself, and is it possible to have robot consciousness? And he's looking down, and he's checking the data, and there have been the climate wars in between because humans have muddled through to try to solve the climate change crisis, and temperatures are higher, and sea level has risen, and cities like Venice have been abandoned. And yet somehow we figured out to get our act together, and we are on the path to getting back to some kind of stable environment. And as he looks down, he sees that the landscape is covered with, he can see the nuclear power plants and the very few fusion plants that are online by that time. And he's checking the data in the cloud using his device, which is actually a chip embedded behind his left ear that, think of your iPhone in a chip, and Siri is in your head, and you just talk to it and it connects you to the net. And he looks some stuff up and he finds out that, they're going to reach baseline in another 17 centuries. Okay. And they planted 1 trillion trees, and they have carbon sequestration, carbon capture. And we, of course, have a non-carbon society that's based on solar, wind, hydro, and nuclear. And that's where we get the energy.
I actually meant on the individual robots. So are they battery powered?
Well, I described 2 kinds of robots. There is a mecha, which is about 3 meters tall, triangular shaped face, no eyes, doesn't talk to you, it just does stuff. And there is a Pippa-bot, a personal, intelligent, physical robot. And a Pippa-bot is a little bit shorter than the average human, has around sort of an oval face, and it has cartoonish features so that it's not intimidating. Those are the 2 standard designs. And think about so the answer exactly to your question, I don't describe exactly that mechanism. I describe what they look like and how big they are and how they operate. This one talks to you, but one can imagine, you think of the Boston Dynamic robots we've seen dancing. We saw I think it was the Honda robot at the last Olympics, shooting free throws from the center line. Those ones, if we think through the technology, are fairly heavy. They have trouble making the battery small enough, et cetera. But folks are working on that. And if you think about 140 years, one would can believe that the power supplies will be small enough and light enough that will be possible. But a good question. That is probably that is an engineering challenge, to make them small enough and light enough, right?
Yeah. I asked because I do write science fiction and I have written some stories with humanoid robots. And I've thought about the power supplies, and there's batteries, but current level of technology only kind of works. There's theoretical nuclear batteries that only kind of work. There's fuel cells, which kind of work, but you can't just shove cookies in them.
Right. Yeah. 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 Well, and okay. And Alex, I appreciate your attempt at hard science, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, one can't just wave a magic wand and this stuff happens. There are laws of physics. So, yeah. In your three examples, I have a strong doubt that we'll use something nuclear just because we'll be worried about having all those little radiation sources all over the place. Right now we rightly worry about electric cars. If the batteries get hit, if the car gets hit in an accident, they can be exploding, right? How do you prevent that? And well, we're figuring that out, but yeah, it's dangerous. So you got to be careful. You trade one thing for another. So yeah, but I think that the economics will drive us to solve those engineering problems, and there's no law of physics that prevents us from getting there.
And then the other thing that you mentioned, the little chip in the character's head. I feel like future generations may have a different perspective than I do. I do not want Siri in my head. I don't even particularly want Siri on my computer.
Okay, well, I'm with you. So the opening scene in the book has Joe talking to his PIDA, PIDA. A PIDA is a personal intelligent digital assistant. It's basically Siri, 10.0, right? That and let's just think about that. Where does the iPhone go from where it is now in 140 years? Again, hard science. What do I think is highly likely? Well, what will happen is that you won't be carrying that phone around in your hand, and it'll be a chip. And it just popped into below the skin, and it's connected to a corneal implant, and then it can transmit, think about like a future Bluetooth kind of connection that paints text on the corneal lens, right? Okay. And this connects to the internet, the net, as they call it. So this is a nest, a neural to external systems transmitter. Okay, that's all it is. You can talk to it. Elon Musk, a couple years ago, demonstrated the Neuralink. I don't think so. in 140 years, again, I'm trying to take a hard science view. Yes, we will. It will be possible to use that technology to connect directly to the brain. We're using it already to help folks with severe handicaps, such as paralysis, that sort of thing. But I doubt that it will be mainstream because we've had 1,000,000 years of evolution to evolve hearing and sight and speaking, and so we'll just talk to the device. So in this future world, in Unfettered Journey, Joe gets on the airplane, as I mentioned, but normally he just talks to the device, and it translates speech, and it connects to the internet, can look things up. So if Joe wants to say, "Where's the nearest pizza shop?" It will look it up, and it will paint a little line on the little cornea, like a little map. It's an augmented reality map overlay, an ARMO, and your ARMO just shows you where to walk, and you can just follow that on the map. So it's sort of a little bit of an overlay of the technology, the digital technology onto your world. By the way, Microsoft is already developing this and has it in factories to help workers figure out how to do stuff. So you can, if you're a worker in one of these plants, you can look up the how do you fix this list, and it will lay it on a heads-up display and help you do that. So we already have map overlays and that kind of stuff. So this will just be standard. And so you use this nest to connect. But back to when you get on a plane, well, it's rude to talk to yourself in a public stance. So in that case, as a child, Joe learned 100 keywords. And he can think search, and it recognizes the word search, and then he can think something else. And it can get the gist of what you were thinking to then look stuff up and portray it on your cornea. That's the extent of using neural links. Most of the time, you just talk to it. So again, this is a future that I think is more highly likely. And again, it's because what are the limitations of the evolved human species? We use speech and vision, and those are optimized in our brain. So, and here's a critical idea. There's a lot of science fiction that imagines crazy, what I call crazy stuff. We will be, we'll have uploaded brains, we'll be cyborgs. And I just don't think that's reasonable. Yes, we'll be augmented in some simple ways, simple enough so that if you explain it to someone like I just did, your first reaction might be, wow, that's a little eerie. But then if you think about it a little bit more, you go, well, that sounds okay. In the same way that we've learned to carry our cell phone around with us, and some people walk down the street looking at it. This will be part of life, but it's not that weird. And, so we'll still be very human. We'll be very much the same. That's my hard science view of the future.
Yeah, I imagine there will be some cyborgs around, but they'll be maybe considered kind of weird, like Google Glass was 10 years ago.
Yeah. Well, in fact, so so Joe meets a fighter, and this is an adventure and a love story. And this other character lives in sort of an alternative community, if you will. And it's a place called the Community Dome, or sometimes, as other people call it, the Combat Zone Dome, because any one of our listeners have heard of or been to Burning Man. There's the analogy. What's an alternative community look like in the future when there's not a whole lot of work, and how do people really live? So in this kind of a world, it's imagined that the sort of the working class, some of the last heavy jobs they did, they use sort of an exoskeleton to do things. So it's like a suit that you would just climb into, and it you wear it and it helps you lift things, that sort of thing. Well, by 2161, even those jobs have gone away and there aren't any more. And so these the folks in these alternative communities started to use these suits to actually sort of battle the robots, because the robots took all their jobs. So they have these sort of fights. Think of them as almost like samurai fights between humans in an exoskeleton and the robot, and they're and that's what happens. And so you have those kind of battles going on, but again, these are humans just wearing these things. They're not really cyborgs, but every once in a while someone gets hurt, and as the character says, there's a talk, because sometimes you lose an arm, and then it's fixed, right? It has to be sewed back on, and the technology is good enough that you can repair that sort of thing fairly completely. But she says, no, we don't. This idea of having cyborgs is overblown. It's not really the way we think about it.
So it seems like this book was taking all of your experience in half a dozen different branches of the tech industry and putting it together into this coherent view of the future.
Yeah, that's right. And part of that is I have this view that, in some ways, maybe some science fiction has given up on trying to predict the future because it's so darn difficult. Imagine you wrote a book in 2006, 2007, the iPhone came out, and the world's totally different. And then how many of those plots are completely wrong now, right? It's so hard to predict the future, I think. But I think that's a very critical role of science fiction. Alex, you did, I think, last year a series talking about you talked about the new wave of inner space soft sci-fi that replaced the classic sci-fi. And I think you mentioned that folks like Isaac Asimov were opposed to that because they were hard science fiction writers. And then there was a new wave with people like Larry Niven and Ringworld and Paul Anderson, his book Tau Zero, which I loved when I was reading that as a kid. All of those are sort of getting back to hard science fiction. Well, I think haven't we swerved more into fantasy again? And
Definitely.
I think, yeah. So I think it's important though to what's the purpose of science fiction? Well, there's lots of purposes as your podcast demonstrates. But, one is to escape into other worlds. One is to imagine what could happen in sort of the worst case in various kind of technologies. There's lots of dystopian science fiction out there. And one is to help imagine the future in a realistic way so that we can focus on the right problems. And that's where I'm at. I think that we have a lot of challenges this century. I think it's going to be very hard to cross that chasm from where we are now to what is highly likely. And so let's go back to what I said initially. The most important technologies this century will be bioscience and AI and robotics. And what I've said about the AI and robotics is that the likely end result is we'll have lots of computers and lots of robots and lots of AI, and that those will do more and more things, and we will not have very many jobs, but we'll have lots of stuff. So that could be a utopia. But who owns the robot factories at that point? How does that work? How do the economics of this highly likely future work? And so, I think that means that the economic system will be completely redone in a very different way. And if we don't cross that chasm as the jobs go away to figure out how we come out on the other end, then we face lots of social disruption. But if we can cross that chasm, if we can do that successfully as a species, then we can end up with a situation where we have lots of stuff and there'll be enough for everyone. And if we can solve the climate change problem, the other big existential problem for humanity. But if we could do that, if we can manage to focus on those issues and we can do that successfully, I can be reasonably optimistic. But these are hard problems, and that's what we need to focus on. And that, I think, is a really crucial objective that science fiction can help bring everyone together around.
And that is something I've wondered about. If robots do take all the jobs, what does the economy look like? And reorganizing things, I think they call it stakeholder capitalism these days, is one of the ideas. Yeah. A lot of the older sci-fi stories, even something like Star Trek, posits a post-scarcity society and just kind of assumes everything will work out. But it's going to be a complicated transition.
Well, it is. And well, you mentioned Star Trek. That's a fairly hopeful, moral-driven storyline, right? I think it's true that what is that? Most of the original Star Trek takes place in about 2300, that century. But as I remember the timeline, somewhere around 2100, they have the eugenics wars, where there's an enormous battle over whether humankind should change the human genome fundamentally. And that's where the wrath of Khan comes from. Khan and some others are genetically changed humans who've got superpowers. And what is it? I think the storyline is that 90 million people die in the eugenics wars. Okay. And the result of those wars is that humanity decides that we shouldn't monkey with the human genome. But then people like Khan become outcasts and they're racing across the galaxy. So, that's a problem too. Okay. And that is also a problem this century, I think. There are lots of debates with CRISPR-Cas9 as a technology that can do that. In fact, it was done a couple of years ago by a Chinese scientist who was outcast as a result of genetically altering the germline of a couple patients.
And you said you backfilled a degree in astrophysics.
That's right.
Which, of course, is my field. Did that influence your book at all?
Well, it does. And actually, I've got a great friend at UC Berkeley, and we were helping him with a lot of hard science on supernova research. So supernovas, of course, are used as the standard candle for sort of refining Hubble's constant. So yes, I love that astrophysics and cosmology. And here's how it informs the book. So a lot of science fiction imagines, faster than light spaceships, right? And you and I know that's just not possible. And all the standard model, everything we know about physics, that's not going to happen. It seems to be well understood that Einstein's speed limit, the speed of light, is true. And some of the ideas that we'll use wormholes, or et cetera, you and I also know the physics that what it does to cells, if you're trying to imagine those forces, no one's going to live through that. So here's how this, in two ways, I'll give you two examples, how this influences my book, Unfettered Journey. The first is that we won't be leaving the solar system anytime soon. So in 21621, there is an orbitable base orbiting the moon that is launching exoplanet probes. And there are 1,000 robots working on this, and one of the and the manager of this is a woman named Dina. And this is a cool job. Wouldn't you love to have that job, being manager of that? But it's really hard to accelerate any amount of mass to anything, even for a fraction of the speed of light. So no, in 2161, we've got a few Mars bases. We've got some bases on some near Earth asteroids. We're doing some mining. We've got a few bases on the moon. We've got a telescope observatory on the moon. But that's it. We are not going to have 100,000 people living on Mars. And in fact, I use a term, planeteer. So Dina says, I'm not even a planeteer yet. That is a person who spent at least a decade off Earth, in either orbit or in a moon base or something. I'm not even a planeteer, because to spend a decade of your life outside of the Earth's cocoon would be ridiculously difficult. You'll have to exercise like crazy just to maintain a modicum of health. You'll live a shorter life. You'll be separated from everything you know. It will be horrible to do that. And yet some will try to be planeteers, right? That will actually take that challenge on. But it's not going to be many. That's my view of what it'll be like 140 years from now. It's okay. And then here's the second idea. We have now the James Webb telescope and we are discovering more and more exoplanets, right? That's wonderful. Even before that, there were on the order of 4,000 exoplanets we've discovered. But here's my idea. Either James Webb or probably a next generation after that, but one of those space telescopes by the year 2050, I predict, will have the answer to a fundamental human question. Say 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 light years from Earth. Are there any habitable planets within that distance? Under the Star Trek M-class planets. Are there any habitable planets? And we will know the answer to that question. Okay, so now by 2050. So now think about that. If the answer is yes, well, that's great. We found one that's 4 light years from Earth, and we can imagine that maybe in a millennium we could do something. These are long time frames to do that. But what happens if by 2050 that we find the answer, and the answer is no? There's not one within 200 light years of Earth. I think what that means is, well, we'll be very sad, but that means that 80% of science fiction will be telling a story that most folks will realize is not ever going to happen. That would be very sad. I really hope we find one. But now think about this in terms of hard science, science fiction. As I said, we will know the answer to that profound question.
And JWST is not going to find it unless we get very, very lucky.
Yes.
The next generation telescope that doesn't have a name, but we in the biz have been calling it LUVEX.
LUVEX, okay. I didn't know that. Thank you.
Because it's a combination of the mission proposals LUVOIR and HABEX.
LUVEX, okay.
That's probably going to launch in the early 2040s. And if there's a habitable planet within maybe not 200 light years, but within 30 light years, that probably will find it.
Okay, so thank you. You've just confirmed my thought process, but I am not an astrophysicist, but as you said, I studied this. So yeah, thank you. That's so my forecast that by 2050 we'll know the answer to that program question sounds to be about right, huh? Yeah. So okay. So just to turn back to my book. So we've given the hard science view, but so the book is an adventure and love story, and it's focused on a question that came out of my my degree in philosophy, and in theory of mind, and what is the mind really? What is that thing that is you and me? And then a subsequent tertiary question is, will robots ever have that? And clearly we've had that in the news relatively recently. I think in the last year there was a Google engineer that said that one of their pieces of AI was sentient or conscious, and that was poo-pooed by everybody as we're clearly not true there. But is it ever possible at all? And so that is a key theme in my book. The main character, Joe, is an AI scientist, and his job at the AI ministry is to make that work. He's had a lot of doubts and meanwhile, the robots are walking around among us, and as he's talking to an academic, the guy says, well, wait a minute, it's everyone kind of thinks that they're conscious. And Joe goes, well, the dirty secret is it's just cheap tricks all the way down. It's not really true. No, we've never gotten there yet. And so, there's a hard science, there's the hard problem of consciousness. What is it really? As David Chambers described it. And, how does that happen? Can you even make robots sentient, let alone conscious? Sentience is the ability to feel. Consciousness is something beyond that. Most philosophers of mind think that consciousness requires something called qualia. Qualia is what is it like feeling of an experience? What is it like to taste an apple? What is it like to see the color red? And philosophers of mind tend to believe that consciousness requires an embodiment in the world, and that qualia, that what is it like, that drives our conscious experience. And how do you put those into a piece of software? That's really hard, maybe impossible. So that's one of the main themes through the book Unfettered Journey, as Joe explores those questions of what is his own consciousness, what is it really, and then finally the sort of the ultimate question in Unfettered Journey, ultimate philosophical question is, do we have free will? Do we really have free will, or is it just a deterministic machine or not? So you can see that my book is multi-layered. It starts with a sort of a hard science frame, a highly likely future, I believe, with lots of nonlinearity. Who knows how we're going to get from here to 2161? A lot of things can go wrong. And will that be utopian? Will it be dystopian? I don't know. That's the frame. And then when that year ticks around, and if humanity is still checking along, muddling through, trying to solve our problems, how do we deal with the problems of what do we do? How do we find meaning in the world? How do we find purpose? How do we deal with who we are? So that's Unfettered Journey, my book.
And there's plenty of rabbit holes we could go down there. I spoke to the mathematician John Conway once. His opinion was that free will is basically an incoherent concept in a materialist world, at least.
Well, I disagree. But I liked your caveat there. So I'm a scientist in terms of my mental structure, my framework. I believe in a closed physical universe, and if we look at what we believe very strongly based on the fundamental physics, and we believe that There is sort of a deterministic elements within how the world works in terms of Schrodinger's equation, the wave function, right? We still don't know what causes it to collapse. I firmly believe that the Everett interpretation is wrong, okay? Even though it's gaining some further followers in recent years. And I don't think we know the answer there. And in fact, one of the recent winners of the Nobel Prize for Physics deals with Bell's theorem and non-locality, and Aspect is one of those the winners because those experiments over the last roughly 20 plus years have shown that non-locality is probably true, right? And that means that our fundamental notion of how the universe is organized, how the physics works at the particle level is somewhat wrong, because we have this model in our head of billiard balls, particles as billiard balls bouncing into each other, one hitting another, and that is the basis behind this deterministic machine kind of model in our head. But that model is predicated upon having particles that exist in a certain place. They have locality, and these experiments show that that's not true. There is not that locality as we imagine it. So, for example, physicists like Carlos Rovelli, they in recent writings have suggested that maybe the fundamental nature of the universe is relational. Carlo Rovelli's book, Helgoland, he states that very explicitly. That was about a couple years ago. Tegmark, the relational mathematical universe, his book has the same kind of concept in it. Some of the theoretical physicists are talking about a relational universe. In the philosophical field, there were a couple folks. There was a book called Everything Must Go by Ladyman and some of his colleagues at Oxford back in 2012. And the philosophers, this suggests that metaphysics, metaphysics is the philosophical study of what there is at the fundamental thing that is. This book, Everything Must Go, is an argument that philosophical metaphysics is wrong. It's non-scientific. It's been kind of wandering off in its own ivory tower for a long time, very divorced from much of fundamental physics, which have discovered a lot of things that prove those philosophical ideas are wrong. And so this book suggests that philosophers need to start over, become much more scientific, base their philosophy on the physics. So again, another statement that our fundamental understanding of how things are organized is not quite correct. And so, that's when I was working on my philosophy master's and writing my thesis back in 2010, 2011, actually before those books came out, and I came to some similar conclusions. So I give you all that background because you raised the question of whether free will is even possible. And I think that there is a way to describe a free will, not just a simple free will, but a free will we can all want to have, that is a true description of how the universe works. And that's in the book too. So.
And for the listeners, the Everett interpretation is the many worlds interpretation.
Correct, yes. So I would hope that some of your readers and listeners will look for my book, Unfettered Journey, which you can find wherever books are sold.
So what was your writing process in creating this book?
Let's see, the writing process, well, I some of the ideas go back, as I said, 30 years, particularly some of the reading on free will and thinking about those issues, and dabbling in the science, fundamental physics. After I finished my master's in 2012, I started to think about writing this book, which would try to present some of these ideas to a broader audience. And then I spent about 3 years writing the book and then some year plus editing the book afterwards. And the process involved a lot of, I'm a planner, so I wrote a 50-page outline. And so, because I think it's important as a writer to be an author when your readers read the book, they feel they're in comfortable hands, that they believe that the author is taking them on a journey, not wandering around in some cul-de-sac. And so I found that process was actually very helpful because I never had writer's block. I knew what I was going to write each time I sat down.
I write outlines, but I've never done 50 pages.
Well, Hemingway talked about that, leave a little ink in the bottom of the well at the end of every day, so we're going to start. Yeah, but by giving myself enough structure, I really did know where everything was going. But then the characters start talking to you, waking you up in the middle of the night, whispering in your ear, and then clearly creativity comes from that. So I don't think that one need worry as much as you might if you are having the creative urge come out. It will happen. So
it sounds like you approached it more from a narrative angle rather than a world building angle.
That's correct. Yeah. The world building, I was actually trying to limit the world building as much as possible to make it concise and then focus a lot on the characters. As I said, this is also a love story. And I think I was surprised myself that the order of a third of the book is dialogue. I didn't know I could write dialogue before. I think it turned out okay.
Who would you say, in terms of sci-fi authors, was your biggest influence?
I love Isaac Asimov. As a kid, I just thought he was the greatest because he wrote accessible science, and I read a lot of his sort of nonfiction books, as well as wonderful characters. And of course, the Foundation trilogy is probably somewhere near the top in my mind. Just the span of those three novels and sort of a galactic level view, which also, in some ways was an analogy to World War II, right? The main bad guy is sort of an analog of Hitler, which was, front and center in the thinking of that time.
Do you mean the mule?
Yes.
I hadn't thought of it that way before.
Yeah.
So, Unfettered Journey is your only novel to date, I believe. Do you have plans for any others?
Not sure yet. We'll see what happens next. Too early to tell.
Okay. Well, to wrap up, there are two questions that I like to ask, especially of fiction authors. The first is, do you have any must-reads in sci-fi that people might not have heard of?
Oh, that's a tough one. No, I can't really suggest anything that people would not have heard of because no, I'm more on the standard. Although let's see, Roadside Picnic. I don't know if anyone has heard of Roadside Picnic.
I've heard the title.
So the backstory on this one, in the sort of the 1970s, Russian science fiction writers had their own genre going because it was one of the few ways that you could write something that the Soviet censors wouldn't ban, because the censors would look at something, okay, here's a science fiction book, and they wouldn't read much further. So Roadside Picnic is one of those books that snuck by the censors, and it has an interesting take. So we've thought about the Alien Contact novels. You have the War of the Worlds. They're all going to come and kill us. Or you have these, Star Trek, the Vulcans meeting. We're all going to be friends together. This Roadside Picnic is a different take. So the thesis is these aliens land in about a half a dozen places on Earth, and then they leave. And it's as if, we were like ants at a roadside picnic, and they didn't even bother to talk to us because we were so primitive. And so the book deals with these half a dozen sites, and I think the idea is some astrophysicist does the math and figures out that they must have come from in the direction of Deneb, and then they stopped and then they left. And so there's a handful of places on Earth that are these toxic waste places that are surrounded by fences, and the governments have guarded them. But there are weird things in them. So if you can sneak into one of these places, you can maybe discover some amazing technology that you don't quite understand. And so they are very dangerous because this stuff can kill you easily. So there's a whole group of folks called the shirkers, I believe, who sort of make a living out of sneaking into these places and trying to find some of this technology and understand it. And so this whole shirker society is actually an analog and sort of a description of some of the Soviet situation at the time. So it's a minor classic and just more famous for an example of Soviet science fiction from about the 70s.
And in my episode on techno thrillers, I noted that a lot of early Soviet science fiction was along the techno thriller lines.
Okay. I have not read much, but that's a key one for me.
Mm-hmm. And finally, what advice do you have for aspiring writers?
I think that one should spend time sitting down and writing, but in the seat time, as they say. It's the best way to actually get something down on paper. Right now we're in November. We've got the NaNoWriMo, Writers Month. I'm not a big fan in trying to write that fast, but I do think it's important to put a schedule together, set some time aside, try to hold yourself to it and to write. As I said, I'm a planner more than a pantser, so I think it's helpful to know where you're going in some way, because then your writing will be more effective and you'll be less likely to write yourself down into some cul-de-sacs, and get that first draft done. And then edit like crazy, edit 10 times more than you ever imagined that you needed.
All right. I've never done Nano in November myself, just because November is the busiest month of the year in academia.
Okay. So pick January rather than the non-drinking month, right.
All right. Well, Gary Bengier, thank you for coming on the show again.
Alex, it's my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
This has been A Reader's History of Science Fiction. This podcast is hosted by Libsyn and available wherever you are right now. I think you know how podcasts work. You can find me on YouTube at Science Meets Fiction, on Twitter, since it is still standing, at SciMeetsFiction, and my website, sciencemeetsfiction.com. And also, new this week, I am now on Mastodon. You can find me there at SciMeetsFiction at universodon.com. That's the word universe, Odon. I'll be mirroring things there, slightly adapted for the format. The next episode will be another interview. I interviewed Dr. Margaret Whitecamp, the curator of the National Air and Space Museum, about her new book, Space Craze, in which she discusses the history of America's relationship with science fiction and the real-life space program. Thanks for listening.